Welcome to our Imaginal Cafe webinar for tonight. We have a really tight schedule, and I'm really looking forward to us having some good time together. So let me go through what our outline is, and I'll be doing something called sharing the screen. If you've never done that before, you've done it now because I'm sharing the screen with you. Okay, so let's take a look at what we're going to be going through today. We're going to spend some time looking at what is this thing that we're calling an Imaginal Cafe. Why do we actually need an Imaginal Cafe? What is the need we're trying to address? I'm going to look at the 5 different elements of the cafe, and we're going to talk about next steps. What will happen after tonight, after today? Then we're going to end, except for those who want to stay on board for questions, comments, and thoughts. Even if you don't have a question, you may want to listen in for some of the answers that may stimulate some of your thinking. Okay, so let me give you a really quick overview of what this thing of what we're calling the Imaginal Cafe. We're looking at a process where we can have dialogue, visioning, and blending our consciousness in order for us to start developing a new society in where each of you lives, and also a new society for our planet as a whole. That to explore issues, to explore opportunities, to look at visions, to catalyze a whole new way of looking at the world. That these Imaginal Cafes are going to pop up like mushrooms around this country and also around the world. We have people literally from around the world who are signed up for tonight. I don't know how many of us are on the call right now. A few, actually. And thank you for coming in at a very different timeline than what the rest of us are working on. So what we want to do is have a process where all of us together can envision a new society. That's the overarching goal for that. But let me spend a little bit of time talking about the need for that new society. Again, I'm going to do a screen share with you. What we know that we've got a challenging process before us. Our planet has never been in the shape that it's in right now. We've never needed never needed a new society more than today. We've boiled this down to what we call the 12 global challenges. These are the 12 issues that every human being faces on this planet right now. These are the 12 issues that is driving us to either extinction or breakthrough. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that the whole issue of how we look at our ecology is just one part of these 12 global challenges. If there's a lot of people focusing almost all of their attention on ecology and forgetting about the other 11. Now, I do a presentation on the 12 global challenges. I'm not going to repeat that right now, but one of the things I'm going to ask is that we spend time thinking about this and thinking about solving the entire problem, not just solving part of it. The other part of this, though, of our issue, is not just being driven by the problem. I mean, one of the things that we've got one of the very, very hidden blessings that we have is having a president who is so polarizing, so divisive, that it's showing us that we need to have another way of thinking about our world and our society. And we need to have a good metaphor. We've got a series of bad metaphors or no metaphors at all. How many people are operating with the notion or the idea of, let's just get rid of Trump and that's all we have to do? Well, that attitude makes the assumption that our society was perfect before he got elected. And it wasn't. There are things that were deeply wrong with our society, deeply flawed with our society. I can go back to that slide of the 12 global challenges, but I won't right now. So what we need is a way of thinking about our world that is going to be focused on a future, focused on a positive future, and focused on a positive future for all. Now, those are some really, really big issues, especially when you look at how big the problem is. So our operating metaphor is the caterpillar. Caterpillar's in your garden, and it's eating the garden. A caterpillar is an eating machine. Its job is to eat everything in sight and not stop. But at some point in time, it does stop. At some point in time, it stops, attaches its butt to a twig, spins a chrysalis, completely dissolves, and out of that comes a butterfly. Now, this is one of the most magical processes on our planet. When the caterpillar spins the chrysalis, there are cells inside that chrysalis saying, hey, let's get back together. We can become a caterpillar again. And things don't go in that direction. You could look at the caterpillar and say, it's dying. Look, it's all dissolved out. But in order for you to say that, it means that you're going to be missing the process of the birth of the butterfly. So we're the people who are the imaginal cells sitting inside the caterpillar, waiting to grow. I believe our time has come. I believe the time for growing this new being is now. And the methodology is sitting right in front of us. And I'm going to talk about that more in about half an hour or so. Right now, though, I want to say a couple of words about consciousness. We all know the Einstein quote. You can't solve the current problems with the consciousness that created the problem in the first place. We know it. We see the posters of it. We might have the poster hanging on our wall, and then we ignore it. We try to solve the problem with the old consciousness. What it takes is people who can think outside the box. That should be you and me and everybody else who's going to listen to the recording. We should be the ones who are thinking outside the box, thinking as though there is no box. How do we want to create the systems and structures of a new society right now? One of my favorite quotes is from Henry Ford, who said, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. The average person couldn't conceive of this thing called an automobile. Henry Ford couldn't conceive of a modern automobile. The Wright brothers couldn't conceive of an airplane weighing more than 200 pounds with a passenger. One of my favorite heroes of the 20th century is Mrs. Bertha Benz, the wife of the creator of the first car, the Benz automobile, who got behind the wheel of this car and took the world's first cross-country trip. She, up until that time, no one took a trip in a car that was further than the return trip to the garage, because you knew it was going to break down while it was going. And she and her two teenage sons got in the car and went 66 miles to the next town over. No one had ever heard of a thing like that. No one had ever done that, especially no woman had ever done that. And it was her forward thinking that actually changed the design of cars to allow them to do a longer than 5-mile or 10-mile trip. Part of the design of the car was her having to stop every once in a while and make repairs, and actually had to use her garters to fix some of the hoses that were breaking loose in the car while she was taking her journey. And so our journey right now, our journey into a whole new society, starts with a step. And this Imaginal Cafe is our next step. Last point on this before I call on Delaney to say some more on this. All of us are holders of the old consciousness. We tend to believe that all we have to do is get Donald Trump to change his consciousness, or get rid of him and everything is fine. Or change the people who are in the oil industry, change their consciousness and everything will be fine. Or change this one and change everybody except myself. The goal, though, of the Imaginal Cafe is for all of us to recognize that all of us have to change our consciousness, and that all of us can do so, and that all of us are going to be the participants in this process. Okay, I'll now take a breath, and I'll now call on Delaney to take those thoughts one step further. And there she is.
Hello. So why do we need a new society? We live in a society that values materialism and social status more than authenticity and human connection. Our technologies and objects receive more care and maintenance than our human friends, children, and animals. Because of our neglect to self-care and human earth connection, there is an epidemic of loneliness, which can lead to drug addiction and, in its most worst, fatal suicide. According to the Health Resources and Services Administration, nearly 1 out of every 3 older Americans now lives alone, and the health effects are mounting. It starts with us. To heal our collective relations with one another and our environment, we need to create a society that is authentic, compassionate, cooperative, and mostly inclusive. My hope is to foster connection to those who feel disconnected, and to create a space where people want to come together to make a difference in their communities. The Imaginal Cafe is the way to do this. By providing informal circles of conscious sharing, we can make a safe space for people to gain connection, emotional support, intimacy amongst friends, and socially develop to move into higher states of consciousness, to face the current reality toward creating a sustainable future for all beings. With strong networks, we can talk about the deeper issues in our society and bridge the gaps of our differences to restore our communities and then our habitats together, facing the 12 global challenges. So how do we design a new society? You guessed it, we address the 12 global challenges. Here's a few short examples. I picked the ones that mean the most to me, but we have to focus on every one of them in the circle. For me, health is very important. I feel like humans, we don't understand the human nervous system, the human emotions, and the value of self-care, respecting human bodily functions, and each other's health challenges. I want us to focus on learning how to just relate with one another and understand each other's personal sufferings. Also, we live in a time where obesity, famine, and malnutrition is a very common occurrence. We need to be focusing on eating nutritional meals because our bodies, they respond to the food that we're eating, and our consciousness responds to the nutrition that comes with that food. And one other thing that I really want us to understand is that we're human. We need a rest. Here in America, we're working 40-hour weeks. It's way too much working. We need to have midday naps, like siesta in Mexico. I would hope that we can create a society where we can have a break in the middle of the day so that we can eat a good food, have a good relaxation, and maybe talk to a friend or two. Another one of the global challenges that I am focusing on is spiritual and cultural. I think it's important for us to meet with each other often and share some food, some connection, and ritual. Ritual is so important for us to relate to one another and to find this deep connection to the earth, to the beings, to the universe. And we should be understanding our human values. Another one of the 12 global challenges relates to ecology and habitat. We should be having reciprocal relationships with each other, the earth and all living beings. We should be learning to create spaces to grow local organic food that doesn't poison us. We don't need, Monsanto putting their pesticides all over our vegetables and giving us cancer. We don't want that, no. And it's even possible in the city to have a garden. There's rooftop gardens, there's indoor gardens. Now we have the technology where we can grow food inside. We don't have to ship it from all over the world. We can just make it local, and it's much easier now more than ever. There's also, we should be respecting wilderness areas for animals. I know we're humans and we have this, we want to be like the caterpillar. We want to consume everything that we go, and we're going to go in the forest. We're going to find all the greens that we can make, and we're going to just take it. But we need to be able to give back. And one way to give back is to allow the forest to just grow on its own, allow the animals to have their space, have the place for them to relate with each other without humans bothering them and taking their resources. One of the global 12 challenges is education. Our current education system is not working for us. Children's autonomy is being taken away from them. They are not being given the freedom to follow their heart's dreams. And who wants to take a standardized test to follow somebody else's standards for them? That's causing a huge shame for all of the children that are growing up, and they're fitting into the boxes of what the society wants instead of creating their own. They should be able to create their own learning and follow the subjects that interest them. Moving on to energy. We don't need to rely on fossil fuels as much as we have in the past. There are so many other options. There are solar, wind, hydro, and they're becoming more and more affordable by the day. I went to California recently, and there are solar panels everywhere. They're powering schools now with solar panels. I was seeing like 1 out of every 10 houses while I was there, they were on the roofs, and I was just like, what? this isn't happening where I'm living, but I'm so glad it's happening there, and it's inspiring to see that it can happen here in Washington or even wherever you are. And so this is the finish for me. I'm going to turn it back over to Sharif. Thanks for listening.
Well, before you sign off, I have a question for you. If you can talk a bit about your own experience as a recent college grad, like this is the kind of like the 12 global challenges mega picture, but how does that picture relate to you? I mean, like what is the reality of you and your friends and the others who are looking at developing the Imaginal Cafe up in Olympia? What's the reality that you're facing?
So I'm a graduate from Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. I graduated last summer in June. It's kind of a sad reality for my generation. We all are coming from not so great financial backgrounds. Children that are turning into teenagers, they're being told to go to college. And the way to college then now these days is to take out student loans. And so being a college graduate, I know I'm privileged. I've graduated with no student debt, but many of my peers have thousands and thousands of dollars of student debt. And so they're walking into a society that they don't fit into. They don't see a career. They don't want to do the 9 to 5, 40 hours a week. A lot of my friends, we want to create eco-villages. We want to have better relations with each other. So at Evergreen, I led a student club called Common Bread, which is a potluck club, and we focus on human connection, spirituality, and we even add in a lot of ecology and other aspects. But we do circles. We'll talk in circles, and we're trying to create this new world together. And so we have a group of maybe 10 or 20 people, and some of us have moved on to start sustainable building companies. Build a Bus is addressing homelessness and hygiene. There's Wellspring Community, which is a small little eco-village. And so we want to create a better world for each other and be healthy together.
Good. Thank you for saying some more about that. We didn't practice this, which is actually good because you and I could just keep talking about these subjects for the next couple of hours. Okay. I want to say one more thing about this notion of creating city gardens. And the city I'm thinking about right now is Singapore. Singapore is a city. It's also an island. It's also a country. It's also a river. It is everything, and it's very, very compact. So they wind up having to import almost all of their food. It's a very rich city, and so they can afford to import all of their food, and they know that that's unsustainable. So one of the things they're building right now and there's a limit to how much land there is. It's an island. It's surrounded by ocean. So what they're doing on their land is creating these high-rise growing skyscrapers where they're going to grow all the food they need right there on the spot. And they're going to keep creating more and more of these. Their goal is not only to grow all the food they need. Their goal is in 10 or 20 years to start exporting food to other countries. Now, that's called having a vision. Whether you agree with the Singapore vision or not, at least they're thinking about the future. Whether you agree with the Singapore vision or not, they don't have tens of thousands of people living on their streets as homeless people. And that's because they decided everybody's going to live in public housing. 80% of Singapore residents live in public housing. So, and some of that public housing is really, really fancy. I can keep talking about Singapore, but that will keep us here for a few more hours. Let me share the screen with you again so that we can talk about the elements that will make up the Imaginal Cafe. And those elements will include the element of consciousness, the element of visioning, the element of dialogue, the element of acting, how to act in the world, and the element of revenue. So let me address each one of these for a few minutes, and then we'll move on. In terms of consciousness, this is something some of you who know me know that I made a journey to the Himalayas about 6 years ago, and wound up in the proverbial cave in the middle of nowhere, and had a revelation at the 15,000 foot level. And the revelation was very long, and I'm going to give you a site to the Himalaya revelation point. And one of the things that I got there was that we, human beings, needed to come together and start blending our consciousness again. We, human beings, have lived with a blended consciousness for the majority of our time on the planet, that we could be clear that we were sharing each other's consciousness. Somewhere around 10,000 years ago, that turned out, somebody said, oh, that's a bad idea. We should have individualized consciousness. It's all about me. Well, this has been an interesting ride that we're on. The ride is about to take us over a cliff, and that cliff leads to destruction. We can change the course, though, and we can change that course back to sharing our consciousness. How do we do that? Well, the place where we shared consciousness, that most clearly shared our consciousness, was in churches or temples or mosques or synagogues or covils or you name it, but those kinds of places. And many of us have had the experience in those places of sharing consciousness. The problem with those places is each one says, we're the exclusive way of doing it. No one else can do this. You're not even talking to consciousness. You're talking to the devil. And that turns into just another way of separating people. What we're going to do is have a process where we get to share a consciousness without any dogma, without saying, you've got to believe a certain thing, or you got to wear certain kinds of clothes, or you've got to do certain kinds of things. I can say a lot more about that, and I'm not. The second part, though, is visioning. And I want us to think about this for a second. When we talk about a vision for a society, right now, in the 21st century, almost all of our visions for society are driven by our technology. We have this thing that is going to be shoved down our throats in the next few years of driverless cars. Well, who the hell needs a driverless car? Who asked for that? And the answer is very few people, if any. And the reason we're getting it is because the technology allows us to do it, so therefore we're going to do it. I think that there should be something else driving us to our future, and that something else should be us, not technology saying we can cram more into one of these devices, so we're going to cram more into it. We should not be ruled by our devices. We should be ruling our devices. And so our challenge is how do we come together as human beings and vision a world that actually works for all beings? That doesn't mean a world that works for all Democrats, or a world that works for all Republicans, or a world that works for all Americans, or it doesn't mean a world that works for all human beings. It has to be a world that works for all living beings. As Native Americans say, all my relations, and my relations are with all. And so that becomes a focusing element of how we do conversations inside the Imaginal Cafe. Now, conversation is a very, very big piece of the Imaginal Cafe. How can we learn how to talk to each other as though we were still part of the same human family? Now, I know all of us have had the experience of seeing online conversations where people are talking to each other, talking at each other as though they're not even the same species. People are talking at each other with ultimate disrespect, with ultimate derision. They're throwing verbal bombs at each other. They're not engaged in discourse. Well, those verbal bombs will create a society that works for no one. It doesn't even work for the speakers. What we need to be engaged in is, how do we have the society how do we have a conversation, a dialogue process that uplifts everyone and starts healing those parts of our hearts where we're not where we're disengaged. As Delaney was saying, those of us who are living these solitary lives that are disguised by things like Facebook into thinking that you're actually connected to people, when you're not connected to people, you're connected to a two-dimensional image on a screen. How do we get beyond that so that we can have face-to-face, heart-to-heart, connected conversations with each other and with the other, however you characterize the other, and have those conversations actually go somewhere? That gets to my fourth point, which is, how do we act in the world? Because what's going to come out of these conversations is action, not just blah, blah, blah. We're talking to hear ourselves talk. But once we see the vision of where we need to go there. And we need not to call upon the existing caterpillar leadership and ask them to start behaving like a butterfly. They can't do it. Someone said this joke, never ask a pig to sing. You won't like the results that you get, and it really annoys the pig. So we need to not annoy anybody. We need to not ask anybody to do something they are incapable of doing. A caterpillar is incapable of flying. No matter how much you ask it, you threaten it, no matter how many times you demonstrate against a caterpillar, it won't fly. It can't. What we need to do is create and become a completely different being, one that can fly. So we'll start off with some really small projects and get bigger and bigger and bigger. We're going to share information between all of the Imaginal cafes. So we'll have this very fertile pot that's going to be bubbling around, and we're going to create the elements of that new society. At first, it's going to look a lot like a Model T. It's not going to go very fast. It's not going to go very far. It's going to be very loud, etc. But we know how to make things better, and we know how to increase that process. My last point is looking at revenue generation. What I mean by that is Um, um, and we'll talk a little bit about the Commons Cafe, which was the precursor to the Imaginal Cafe. But one of the reasons I called a halt to our very successful experiments with the Commons Cafe was that it wasn't connected to anything else. We didn't have the next steps in mind when we started. And that means that you could create this really good, feel-good situation, and everybody's patting themselves on the back because everybody's feeling great. And it doesn't have lasting ability because it doesn't go far enough. What we want to do is put the seeds in place, but also generate the enthusiasm and also, very importantly, the revenue that will start the process of creating the next steps for the Imaginal Cafe. So I could say an awful lot more about that. I'm going to ask to see if there's a hand or two if you have a question that has to be asked before we get to our question and answer point in 16 minutes. I'm not seeing any hands, so we're going to move right along into our next step. Okay, and the next step is going to be talking about the process of next steps and buy-in. I'm going to talk a little bit about awareness raising and fundraising. And then I'm going to call upon Delaney to talk a bit about what's happening in Olympia. And I'm going to ask my friend Greg Ganshaw in St. Louis to talk a little bit about what's happening in St. Louis. And then we're going to be where we need to be. Okay, so in terms of awareness, right now, and starting through the next couple of weeks and months, we want to increase the awareness of this notion called the Imaginal Cafe. We want the 15 folks on this call and then the other 30 or 40 folks who have signed up. We want all of you to start talking and buzzing about the Imaginal Cafes. We want you to we want all of us to start talking about this so that we can get to a launch point in September, and we're aiming for mid-September right now. Get to a launch point where we can have as many pilots for the Imaginal Cafe as we can. It would be great if we had a dozen pilots ready to start operations in September. And to keep the buzz going, to let people know that there's another way of looking at this. There's another way of being in the world. It's not doom and gloom and despair. It's, oh, there's a real vision here, and let's get involved in the vision. I think this is very important when we start thinking about us heading into what I call the silly season of the election season, where we get to have a beauty contest between some very unbeautiful people, and we get to vote for something that's evil, and you get to vote for the lesser part of that. What we need to do is start saying there's another way, there's another game in town. We're not, if you don't like the game, stop playing it. And by stop playing it, I don't mean don't vote. I am registered to vote. I vote in all the elections. That takes about 30 or 40 minutes of my time. The rest of my time, I am dedicated to creating a world that works for all being. So the second thing I wanted to say real quickly is about fundraising. We're going to need a lot of money to get this off the ground and to sustain it through its first iteration or two. And that's going to take a combination of some really intelligent, enlightened foundations, if we can find them. It's also going to take some crowdfunding. It's going to take some real angels, some folks who have available means, who are going to dedicate that, who are willing to invest in a future that doesn't exist on the ground right now. More on that when we start talking specifically about fundraising. So let's talk about what these next steps will be. And I'll call first on Delaney to pop back up with a video and to unmute herself and to talk about what's happening in Olympia.
Thanks, Shariff. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about Common Bread, actually. So as I said before, Common Bread was a student club that I ran as a student at Evergreen. And what's special about Common Bread is that it's located in a farmhouse in the middle of the 100-acre forest that is at Evergreen State College. And behind the farmhouse is the agricultural center and the farm. And so I think what's really drawing people to Common Bread is that it's like bringing us back to our roots. It's bringing us back to learning about where our food comes from, being grateful for the food that we're eating. So Common Bread, people just kind of pop up there, they walk through the forest, and they end up at the farmhouse. And we welcome them in, we give them some food, we sit in a circle, and we have, we breathe together, and we sometimes do meditation. And then we'll have a topic of discussion or a workshop that we're leading. I have a list here of different workshops we've hosted in the past. 1 second. So I feel like when you're starting a new society, the first step is to talk about what are your values going to be. And so one of the things that...
Excuse me, Delaney, are you planning on sharing the list, or are you going to put the list on the in the supplemental materials?
I'm sharing it right now. So the list is, so the list of workshops we've had include value setting. We do, how we lead our workshops is we want people to come together. And so if you can imagine, we ask a question, and then we link two people together, and then we link two people to other two people. And then by the end of the night, everybody's had a chance to talk to each other, which is really, really great. And so the different workshops we've had include inclusivity, based off of Shariff's book, Practicing Inclusivity, which he wrote with Leslie. We've had manifestation workshops, we've had intention setting workshops. We also focus on more spiritual type things like music circles, storytelling, self-compassion, authentic relating games. We talk about how to have a healthy relationship. I've had a night where I've taught archetypes. So instead of having, the world telling us who we are, we learn about the different archetypes of what makes us up and what are we embodying right now. We've had workshops on healthy love or the love languages. We've talked about grief. And I feel like a lot of these things are missing in our society. I mean, I grew up, I didn't have any religious background. I'm not a churchgoer. I mean, I do go to church. I value the teachings, but it's not something I do regularly. So Common Bread was kind of like my way of expressing that spiritual connection. But then it goes deeper than that. After we've met at Common Bread, we create really strong bonds with our friends. And so we've moved this. I feel like Common Bread is kind of a traveling club. It's a traveling group of people. I've traveled all over along the East Coast. I've traveled to China, and I've taught these workshops in China and here in the US. I went to Canada, and so I talk about these things, these workshops that I've done, and I build bonds with people as I'm talking about this. And this is what I'm hoping the Imaginal Cafe will have aspects of. And so as long as we have a place where we can sit in a circle, have some food and some drinks, you just pop a question up into the circle, and you can just start sharing, what are your views on a subject? If you want to talk about sustainable energy versus fossil fuels, like it sparks a conversation, people get inspired, and then the next week or so somebody has started a project on that, which is really great. I have a friend named Mason Rolfe, and he's an Evergreen graduate too. He started a solar company, and it's taken him about 2 years to develop, but he's now starting to go door to door to sell solar, and he's also been involved in the politics and at the Capitol. And so it's like we all start from our spiritual, cultural, like family, where we find that connection, that community for our basic emotional health. And then we move those into creating inspiring projects that impact our community. I want to talk more about the different places that we meet. So there's also a place called the Wellspring Community, which is it's a main house. It's also in the middle of a forest. I feel like the forest helps us to feel like we're not part of the city, where, you know, the breaker consciousness, which is in the city, you know, cars, technology everywhere, like hustle and bustle. The forest helps us relax. And so this is a place where we've had fire circles, we've done tree climbing, we've talked about agriculture. There's a small tiny homes on this property of like maybe I think 6 to 9 little small tiny homes. It's still in development, but I'm hopeful that this can be a model for the future of having, you know, like a minimal lifestyle, which, you know, we all participate in growing our own food. We all participate in having maybe a weekly or bi-weekly a community dinner where we're talking about these things so that we can move forward to being better humans. That's all I have to say right now, unless Shariff, you have another question to spark some more thoughts from me.
Of course, I have millions of more questions, but we don't have millions of more minutes of time. What I want to do right now is call upon Greg Ganshaw to join the conversation and talk a little bit about the situation that the occurrence that happened in St. Louis, and what are some of the possibilities of what's going to happen in St. Louis. So, Greg, the floor is yours.
We started right after or right around 9/11. Shariff and I had been doing some work and some workshops, and we had a rollout plan, a pilot of doing a common society approach where we would bring disparate people that didn't normally get together, and bring them to a common place and get a chance to exchange ideas. It was a great plan. We had it at a church. We had about 30 people that were going to be there, and we planned it on September 12th, 2001. Actually, the 13th, excuse me. The challenge became what happened on September 11th. So what we found was all the things that were going on at that time, the stress and everything else, the real high focus, became the perfect pilot for dealing with the issues that we were all experiencing. From that point forward, it grew. We had that small group of 20 or 30 people. We had a chance to communicate. Those people went out to other folks in their networks. And within a relatively small period of time, we had an ongoing Commons Cafe approach, which didn't have some of the goals and resources that we're going to have now with the new process. But what we found was a real interest in people getting together to meet someone else and exchange ideas. We had a very good, you know, how good ideas begin to develop and good communications and networking end up spreading out. We ended up with a very good connection with the owner of a cafe, of a restaurant. Met with her. We talked about what we were trying to do and what was happening. And she made her place available to us on a regular basis. We had certain evenings of the week that she would basically turn the cafe over to us. And so I guess if I was going to use a word to describe the biggest success we had in St. Louis, it was place. That became a place where we did trainings. That became a place where we had meetings. That became a place where we would have up to 45 people for weekend events. And so place, I think, as was just discussed by Delaney, place is an essential area. It doesn't have to be one place, but a place that allows you to create that magnet, that home. The other thing that we had was a network of people that communicated out into their communities. And that's really this next step that we're looking at in St. Louis. I've got that original group. We went through, I think it was 10 or 12 weeks of Catalyst training, and I've got a number of those people. We have St. Louis, the city, as the location where we had our original grouping. And now, to kind of expand out, similar to what Delaney was describing, one of our interested groups and some very special people out in a more rural area are going to be kind of taking what we developed in an urban area and expanding that into a lot of the things that Delaney was discussing. So place is important, but that people network, it's amazing how a lit match just spreads the energy and ideas. I ended up being interviewed for some newspapers, which then ended up being invited to a radio program, the NPR station with its local noon program, and it just mushroomed and grew. We had a successful program that lasted, I'm going to guess, well over a year and a half from start to where we began to do other things. I also went off and kind of set that match approach in New York, Washington, D.C., Florida, and Chicago to get those cities moving in that same direction. We did have one challenge, and that was after you went through, let's say, an orientation, and then you went through a cafe or 3 or 10 or 20, there wasn't a real application next step. We had Catalyst trainings to give our organizers some tools, but what we've done now, and in reviewing the materials that Shariff passed out for this, that's the real application that was missing back then, was what do we take with that energy? What do we take with those folks that we've put together? How do we move that forward in a sustainable, as we're talking sustainable society, a sustainable movement going forward? And that's really where this is chapter 2. This is picking up on what we've learned, how to run cafes that are very effective and very good for the participants, and then how to take it out to the bigger picture.
Thank you for that history of the Commons Cafe and that process. It was kind of like a journey down memory lane for me. And there's a lot of other parts of that process I'd like us to talk about. Greg, I hope you can hang in there for our question and answer time, because I've got some questions that I think everybody else will have. But before we get to that point, I want to goodness gracious, I keep hitting the wrong button here. This is actually a fairly simple button, and it says, "Thank you." We said that this was going to be an hour. If there are people that have to leave at the top of the hour, I'm going to ask them to do that now. Thank you very much for being here. Hopefully you're going to stay involved. Or if you've already determined that this is not for you, by, and we'll come by for a drink at the Imaginal Cafe when we get them up and running. But hopefully this means that there are going to be some of you, and I'm talking slowly to give a chance to folks who want to leave. Some of you are going to be hanging in here. No one has hit the exit button so far, so I'm going to make the assumption that all of you are right with me. And so I'm going to ask Greg another question. First of all, as a Catalyst facilitator for the Commons Cafe process, Greg was going literally around the country. I was going literally around the country. There were there are two sizes of cafes, the small ones, small being between 30 and 80 people. And then there were some really big ones, a few hundred people. And I think it was in Denver, we had 500. And in Omaha, Nebraska, I think we had 650 before the fire marshal closed the room and said, you can't put anybody else in there. And we had about 100 people still trying to get in the room. And so these are really, this was striking a chord, striking a note with people. And in St. Louis, we had gatherings, like I said, as Greg said, the 30 or 40 people involved. But there were also a few larger gatherings. And Greg, if you want to spend like just a minute or so talking about them.
Sure. We had, I think, at least 3 major gatherings. One was about 150 to 160 people. They came from 6 countries, plus about 20 states, plus the local folks in the St. Louis area. We put out invitation. We had speakers to do the introduction, the orientation. We made it actually an entire weekend. We started on a Friday night. We introduced the ideas and the topics, and some people just came to the Friday night as an orientation. And then the balance went through the cafe process on Saturday and Sunday, where we would imagine out through the year 2050. We'd create a vision on 2050, and then we would work in our tables to work towards, if that's where we want to be in 2050, how did we get there? How do we get to that end? And it was a very dynamic weekend. Shariff was there, and we had a number of folks and speakers that contributed to the program. Then we had one that was about 60 people, and that was held at in a kind of a recovery area of St. Louis, Cherokee Street, where a lot of energy and things were going on in an urban center. And we did a full Commons Cafe based around the direction of creating a world that works for all. And then we had another one that was restricted only by the size of the cafe, and it was full. We had that cafe holds normally 30 to 40 people, and we probably had going on 55 or 60. It was very cold January. It was nice to be warm, everybody together. We had a lot of body heat that was keeping us very comfortable. So lots of different ways of doing it, lots of different applications. The cafe is a very useful tool and a resource that you'll learn to trust because things come up with the interaction of human beings. And I've been doing facilitation work and change for about 30 some years, and no two groups are ever the same. There's always some new dynamic that takes place. Some are smooth as glass and others get a little speed bumpy. But if you trust the process and if you set up the expectations in advance for how to create a communications and a dialogue, it's amazing what can take place. In one of our groups, we had I never took in young people. We just kind of made it for like late teenager on. This one group, we had a young man that was 12. And he sat himself right down. He was very a real person, sat right down one of the tables. And at his table was also a closer to my age now, a senior. She was even older than I was. She was 80 years old, and this 12-year-old. Now, there are also 30 or 40 other people in the cafe, but I will tell you, by the end of the evening, everybody gravitated to this conversation that was going on between the 12-year-old and the 80-year-old. The boundaries melted away. The communications, you could feel it. I mean, it was a group that had come together totally. Everybody kind of took their tables and circled around in a big circle by the end, because these two people were creating that energy. And that has happened time and time again, but that was a very specific example.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for, again, the walk down memory lane. As we are talking right now, the cafe is taking form. As we are talking right now, the butterfly is taking shape. I'm going to invite us to, if you have a question or a comment or a thought, please raise your hand, and digitally, and if you can't raise your hand, start your video and wave your hand around so that we can see it. I'm going to, and I'm going to keep talking. This is my threat. I'll keep talking if you don't raise your hand. So you should be asking some questions around what's it take to open up an Imaginal cafe. Now, I'm noticing that there are a few ministers from Unity ministers on the call right now. You may be thinking, oh, I want to do this in my area. Great. We'll do that, if you don't have that as a question, have another question. So I am not seeing any, so I'm going to, I see a hand going up, and this is Parker, and I am going to unmute you. And you are going to share your video, and hey, how's it going? And what's the question?
I guess I'm just curious, like, what's the method? Sorry.
What a question. Okay.
For, getting these different people into this space together, so beyond sort of just one type of people or one group of people, how do you really kind of gather the masses?
Right. So I'm going to answer that from my perspective, and if Greg wants to, Greg and or Delaney wants to add their perspectives to that, they can do so. One of the things that's really important is, that was important for the Commons Cafe, is we didn't want group think. We didn't want to have one group talking to each other going blah, blah, blah. Everybody's preaching to the choir, and nothing gets done. So the way that we did that, we would go to where the opposing voice was present, and just ask people to be there. To give you a couple of examples, we had a cafe that was based on socioeconomic class. So we wanted to have some wealthy people, some middle class people, some working class people, and some poor people. Well, for the poor people, I went to a homeless shelter and said, we want you to bring 10 people to the cafe. We don't want you to make a general announcement and say, well, if you want to come, come. Or put something on your bulletin board. I want you, the head of the center, to go around to 10 people that you think can contribute and make a specific invitation. I want you to go to this place. I went to a church that was well known for being a church with very wealthy people would go there. And I went to the minister and I said, I want you to bring 10 wealthy individuals to the cafe. And by asking the question, who do you want to be there? Then where are they located? There's a place for them right now. And going there and making a personal appeal, not sending an email blast or anything like that. So for the cafe organizers, many of the issues had to do with will they respond to that kind of a personal appeal. And so we would get people in the room that had who are actual or potential adversaries. Here in Oregon, we did a cafe between the folks who were agents of the Immigration and Naturalization Service and the undocumented aliens that they were policing. That took several back and forth negotiations to make the room safe for everyone, to make the room safe for the undocumented aliens, which meant the INS folks were not going to take names. They were not going to take any pictures. They were not taking license plate numbers. They were not going to collect information on the site. To make it safe for the INS agents, my stipulation is if you're in my meeting, you're not going to carry a gun into the meeting, and they freaked out. They believed that folks were going to tear them limb from limb if they didn't carry a gun. And I had to guarantee their safety in order to get them to actually come into the room. So the room has to be safe for everyone. And we did the negotiation that made that take place. Now, because the centerpiece of our work with the Imaginal Cafe is not bringing adversaries together, we're going to be spending less time doing that. But it's still going to be very, very important to get people in the room and getting them to feel comfortable across cultural boundaries or across cultural settings. And Delaney, I think you said you had some more to say about that question. So I'm going to let you say it.
So when you're wanting to bring people together for a cafe, there is a lot of ways to market your cafe. I feel like, so I'm a college graduate. The places that I would have marketed would be colleges, other colleges. I would market at Evergreen. I would market at the local college down the road. I would go to Seattle, market there, or surrounding towns. You can go to other places that are regular cafes, like a coffee house. Go to a coffee house, put up some flyers, sit down, talk to 5 people while you're there. Walk down the road, bring a little flyer, a handbill like this size, and just hand it out to somebody and say, hey, we're doing this week. You should come. And there's many different strategies. I guess one fun thing that I like to do is I have an orange bodysuit, and so I'll wear an orange bodysuit, and I'll just make people just look at me. I'm walking down the road looking like a bee, and I'll be like, hey, come to this. And so it's like a shock factor, and it makes it fun. You have fun. You bring a friend with you. You make it go around the town, parade around, and then hand out a flyer. You can go to, I'm trying to think, you can go to churches, you can go to schools if you want to do a younger cafe for kids that maybe they want to figure out how to make a world that works for all. You can use social media marketing. I do event posting on Facebook. You can use Instagram, but personal invitations are the most powerful, and they always will be. So those are the ones. Make a face-to-face conversation, eye contact, ask a question, get to know the person, and then invite them along. That's I guess all I have to say for now.
Well, one of the things is all of that, and I would assume that depending on the subject of the cafe. Oh, by the way, if you've got another question, start raising your hand.
So I have a question. Somebody asked one in the comments section.
Okay, let me finish this thought though first. So you can have all of these possible outlets, but you also and some of what Delaney was talking about is thinking outside the box. Okay, I don't think I'm going to be the one in the bodysuit. Okay, so I just want to put that up front right now, unless we vote on it. So, but one of the things people were saying that if you want to have African Americans participating in a given dialogue, you have to go to the Black church. Well, we did that a few times and got nobody. No one from that church would come to the Commons Cafe. We started going to the Black barbershops and the Black beauty parlors. Then people started coming, and folks who are in a barbershop are pretty much a captive audience. If you're there, you're going to listen to us for a few minutes. And it got to be a whole different way for us to address that as an issue. So Delaney, why don't you go ahead and ask your question? I'm going to also recognize that Robin has her hand up, so we're going to get to both of those questions.
So I'm asking the question for Purjay. I don't know how to say his name or her name. He wants to, or they want to know if there's anyone doing this in the Memphis, Tennessee area.
Sure, you. Okay, next question. We just volunteered you. I think it's called being voluntold.
I have one question.
Not right. So the real answer is not right now. Stay tuned. It's going to take 2 or 3 people in each area to kind of come together and figure out the mechanisms on how to do this. So yes, Delaney.
My other question is, I'd like to know what types of cafes that are going to become, because I know that there's many different kinds. I want to hear more about that. You can answer this question now or after the next person.
Right. Let me get to Robin first, because if we don't get to that question, we can actually print the answer to that question because we've been thinking about that. So Robin, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself and turn on your video. I can unmute you. I can ask you to, you're jumping around here. Turn on the video. And there she is. Okay.
Hello. Have been working a little bit with the Drawdown project and had a couple of introductory programs of theirs here at my center. And
sorry, do you want to say a word about what Drawdown is?
Yeah, it's Paul Hawkins' work, and he's looked at all of the different things in our societies that could potentially actually turn around what's going on with our climate change situation and draw down the levels of CO2. And it's a broad collection of things, just like the things you're talking about, Shariff. And so their process is to do some introductory evenings and talk about it, show Paul Hawkins videos, and he's an excellent presenter. And then they encourage you to have small groups get together and do this. I think it's a 5-week course. I have not done that yet. And then the group takes on a project, something that they research. What would we need to do to start some solar thing, or whatever their area of interest is. And they actually have an outcome of working together as a small group on on this project that's kind of their common vision, their common excitement. So I'm wondering if there might be an interface between what they're doing and what you're describing, which is so parallel and so much in the same vision as far as I can see.
My quick answer is no, we can't. We have to be completely exclusive and unique as we go to inclusivity. Yes. Okay, I got that off my mind. Paul Hawken is a great guy. He's a friend of mine. I've had a great deal of respect for him for decades. One of his books, Seven Tomorrows, I really think that he should rethink and reissue that book, because it was one of the things that helped to spark me thinking about the future. And one of the things that may happen out of the Imaginal Cafes is that we get back to these 7 tomorrows. That said, I don't know that much about Drawdown. I don't know much about what it's trying to do, but it does sound very analogous. Paul and I have a way of thinking like that sometimes, in ways that can be funny, that I'm not going to talk about while there's a tape running. Yeah, I definitely will look into that, because if you're traveling in a particular direction, you should carpool, and
Yes.
and create this as an opportunity to get ego out of the way, and to get to do something coherent together, even if you're not going to be there for the actual end. Okay, so like let's say that Drawdown is heading for Chicago from Portland, and our goal is to get to New York. It doesn't mean we can't start off from Portland and go together to at least Chicago. So we can start looking at doing something. I'm going to ask, so thank you, Robin. And I'm going to ask if there are any other digital hands going up. If not, and I'm not seeing any more going up, I'm going to go ahead and ask you, Delaney, to give us the next question here.
So the question I have is, what are the types of imaginal cafes? Because you've talked about like adversarial cafes, and I feel like I talk a lot about healing cafes. So I want to know about the different types that you foresee in the future associated with the Imaginal Cafe project. Shariff, you're muted. Just try again.
For those who are not lip readers, I want to talk about 2 aspects of the Imaginal Cafes we haven't talked about yet. One of them has to do with what we're calling imaginal scripts. How do we encourage these dialogues? Well, we're not going to tell the folks in Tulsa, Oklahoma what to talk about or how to talk about it. We are going to provide some ways to approach the conversation, the questions to talk about, the discussion groups. We may have games that we want to play. We may want to do role playing. When we start getting more mature, I want to see some role playing between cities. Like, okay, how does Tulsa and San Diego share information and do things, etc. I think that's going to be really, really interesting. And as we are doing that, we're going to be learning and growing. So out of the conversation in Phoenix, out of the conversation in Albany, out of the conversation wherever we're going to be having them, we're going to be feeding back into the whole how to do these kinds of things. But the specific question was, what kinds of cafes are we talking about? Well, when Greg and I were talking about a very specific kind that we were calling the Commons Cafe. And this was something that would bring either actual or potential adversaries together to talk about the future. Another type of cafe is what I would call the futures cafe. You know, what is our future? What is the future we're looking at, and what is the future that we want, as opposed to the future that we're going to wind up with unless we have these conversations of what is it that we want. Delaney's already talked about the nature of a health and healing cafe. Healthcare and healing, both in a practical sense of how do I heal my gut, or how do I heal my broken elbow, is really, really important. We know the healthcare system we've got right now is dysfunctional. Instead of trying to keep tweaking that, why don't we together start talking about what functionality is? And even more than that, how many of us have heard about these different healing modalities? Some people are doing different spectrums of light to heal themselves, or magnets, or whatever. What happens if we all come together and start sharing these techniques? This actually happened in a really interesting way when I was in the gym one day, and someone was talking about high blood pressure, and all the guys over 60 started talking about high blood pressure. I'm taking this for it. I'm talking that. Well, that's not good for you because of this, that, and the other. Try taking that, or try. It's like we became a community taking care of itself by sharing information face to face. Okay. Then we're going to have trading cafes. And this is something that Greg and his cohort in St. Louis experimented with. How do you take things that you're not using right now and make them available to people who want to use them? How do you do that in such a way that we lower our acquisitiveness, we lower our materiality, and we increase our sharing, we increase our consciousness in our relationship with each other? I was just thinking about this the other day when I was eating a meal at that table right behind me, and I had put my camera on the table, and I was looking at the camera and saying, I'm not using this camera right now. Somebody else could be using this camera right now. They don't have to go out and buy a camera. Here's a camera right here, right now, that they can be using. How do you set up that kind of trading? How's that going to work? How's it not going to work, etc.? Another thing that we can, one of the things that we talked about is how do we go from talking to acting from the cafe? How do we spin off, as Delaney was saying, the folks that want to do solar panels, they're going to meet on another day and they're going to get really intense about these solar panels. The folks that want to create some kind of alternative education structure, they're going to spin off on Thursdays and they're going to talk about the structure. All of it feeding back into the whole so that we can start creating the systems and structures of a new society. Then the most important part to me is how do we spend time with a consciousness cafe? How do I spend time with the things that are going to increase and sustain my consciousness? How do I spend time doing the meditating, doing the chanting, doing the food sharing? How do I do these things in the context of a particular culture? And then how do I do these things across cultures? So I've been blessed to have experienced every major culture on our planet, every major religious function on our planet. So I've been to lots of churches around the world, lots of mosques around the world, lots of Buddhist temples around the world. lots of Jewish synagogues around the world, lots of other places. The only one I haven't been in is the Zoroastrian temple. And I'm sure somebody's going to invite me one of these days. And all of these practices that I learned, chanting, sitting in silence among the Quakers, singing certain songs, doing the salat, doing all these things, opens these doorways into my heart and into the hearts of others. How can we use the cafe to bring all that together in such a way that we're not excluding anyone? I think it's possible to do that, and it'd be really, really interesting to start doing that. So this gives us a whole different way that we can come together, and a whole different way that we can learn and we can focus together. I'm going to ask if there's another hand or two or three. If you want to ask a question, this is the time to do so. I'm not seeing any other questions. So now I've got a question for you. If you're interested in starting a cafe in your town, wherever your town may be, and like I said, we got people on this call from around this country and around the world, raise your hand. So I want to see a digital hand going up for those who would like to be supportive of an Imaginal cafe in your area. So I see a couple of hands going up already, and I think, well, half of the folks are there. If I could figure out a way to raise Greg's hand for him, because he's already said yes, I think we've got pretty much a full house here. And so if and Delaney just waved, so yes, there's another hand up. So so thank you, and we'll keep in touch. If you haven't done so already, you need to sign the registration form. I think almost all of you have done that already. And if you, so that will keep us on the same page at the same time, involved in the same ways. There are lots of other things that we need to talk about, okay? Where money comes from, how's it going to get shared? How do we start generating this revenue that we're going to generate? What do we see happening for the cafe 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Where's all this connecting tissue going to be? But we're going to, we have a few months to do this, so we're going to do this in order. Over the next few weeks, I'm hoping that we're going to launch we are going to launch a crowdfunding campaign that will start to do the process of raising the money. Right now, the Democrats and the Republicans are raising hundreds of millions of dollars for the beauty contest. What we need to do is raise a fraction of that for something that has a realistic opportunity to actually change the society. I'm seeing 3 hands up. I'm going to lower them to make sure that we're starting from a good crop here. If you have a final question, please raise your hand now. If you don't, and I'm talking slowly to give people a chance to get to their buttons. If you don't, what I want you to do is turn on your video and turn on your audio so that we can all say goodnight to each other. So as I'm watching watching everybody coming alive here, and make sure you're doing your audio also. Even if you don't want to show yourself with video, at least be there with audio. And I just want to say thank you so much for participating. This has been really cool, really neat, and I'm looking forward to our next steps together. Delaney, I don't know if you have a last word you want to say for about the evening.
Just that I hope you're all inspired by this project and that you want to start and move this forward so that we can create a better future for all of us and for all the creatures and the trees and all the beings.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
So thank you, and I will see you the next time. We'll send out another notice for you to get involved in our process here. Start the buzz. So thank you very much, and I look forward to our next gathering together.